Okay, Natalie is streaming this. Is that what I see, Natalie? That's what's happening?
Yes, to YouTube.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm Leslie Ambrose. I work on behalf of Heart and Soil Living. I am a
Is that what I see?
backyard gardener.
Yes, to YouTube.
Is there a lag, Natalie? What am I hearing? You're laughing. Okay. So I am a backyard gardener and I just love to learn about soil health and plant health. And I love gardening because I love that feeling of being in nature. I love my bare feet in the soil and I love to poke the seeds in the ground and watch the brilliance of nature and witness that. And um, I, I am a backyard gardener, which means I don't have the heavy responsibilities of farming as my living. So I feel like I have the best of the growing journey here. Um, so I am delighted to be working alongside Natalie Forsbauer, your host for today, the founder of Heart and Soil Living, editor-in-chief of Heart and Soil magazine, a lifelong farmer. She has a wide range of experience from small farms to large farms in different environments and a lot of marketing experience and farmers markets and getting her products into stores. And she has a wealth of knowledge also in polarity therapy. And she has the biggest heart of any human I've had the pleasure of working with and knowing. And I love Natalie. She wants what's best for you. She wants to support you and love you on your growing journey. So I kind of jumped right into Natalie. I just am at the point where I feel like we've all been on Zoom, but I will very quickly mention that when you come in, you are on mute, and that's so we can hear the speaker. When you come in, you're probably not on camera. If you're someplace where you're comfortable, please come on camera. We love to be in the room with you. This is more than just a presentation at you. This is community. So this is, we invite you to engage. We invite you to really be present and look at the people around you, the other heart-centered farmers and gardeners in this room with you. So with Heart and Soil, we are a heart-centered community. So what that means is we have a reverence for nature. We have a love for the land. We want to build community, support you. We want to support each other. We believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, and we are in this together, and we don't do competition. We just are so delighted to have more and more people in the regenerative space, and we want you to learn everything that you can. And with that, I invite you to really think about why you're here. What is it you need today? So invite you to come with an open heart, open mind, curiosity. And come with all your brilliance. What you already know, what you've already done with all your life experience, with all the things you've learned from what hasn't gone well, with all the things you've learned from what has gone well. And come fully. So we invite you to come fully into this room and give yourself the gift of time and engagement. And I just know that being together always makes us stronger. So with Zoom, I said the mute and I said the video. Speaker view in your top right, you'll see a 9 square grid, and you can change the view. So speaker view, you'll be able to see Ben as he is speaking. He'll be largest on your screen. Gallery view, you'll be able to look around the room and see the others in the room with you. When Ben shares his screen, it'll hijack whatever view you're on, so don't worry about that. We have a chat feature. So the bottom center of your toolbar will say chat. I invite you to tell us where you're joining from. We have signups from all over the world, and we are delighted to have you here with us. So tell us where you're joining from, and if you're a farmer or a gardener. If you're new at farming, a new farmer, I guess, is the first decade, right? There's so much to learn in farming. Or if you're, so tell us what kind of growing you do. We'd love to know. I don't know that I did a good job with my Zoom talk here, but that's okay. Put questions in that chat feature. Questions for us, but also as Ben begins his presentation, put your questions in there. And if you just want to start with the letter Q, it'll flag our attention so that Ben does have a presentation for you, and we want to make sure we get to as many questions as we can. We have 90 minutes together. Well, 85 minutes now. Okay, so I think we jump right into it. Natalie, our beautiful host, will be leading this conversation.
That's my cue. Awesome. Leslie Ambrose, thank you so much for welcoming us into the room and holding the space for the inaugural session of the Soil Summit 2025 this year. Revive your soil, grow more with less. It's all about building healthy soil, healthy connections, relationships, and really deepening into who we are, how we're here to serve, and how we can grow together individually and collectively. And I am so delighted and so honored to be in the space with each and every single one of you today, that you'd want to make time to learn alongside us with our speakers this week. Leslie, I teared up when you were talking about the reverence and the sacredness around that, and it's a beautiful thing to see people working with the earth and really amplifying the life of the earth, and whether that's in the soil or in your hearts or in your relationships, I really believe that it's all connected, and I love seeing all these places from around the world popping up in the chat, from North Dakota and Idaho and Canada and the UK and just everywhere. So thank you so much for coming in and joining us. And we are so honored to have the speaker lineup that we do. And these speakers gift us with their time and their resources and their experiences. So be sure to go and find them and follow them on some of them don't even have Facebook or a web page, because they just mostly consult now. But the ones who do, make an effort to go and check out their websites and their socials and just give them some love and maybe send them a thank you. And we have authors in the room and throughout the week who also have some fabulous books. So, and we'll be sharing links to those with you. And we also want to say a big thank you to Highway Seed Products and Microbiometer for supporting us to make this summit possible. So, and you're going to be learning more about both of those sponsors throughout the sessions as well. And on that note, it is a dream come true for me today getting to interview Ben Raskin, who is an all-around amazing human who works with trees. And trees are one of my love languages, actually. I love everything about the trees, the roots and the trunks and the way they grow, the way they reach up to the skies and the way they reach down into the earth, and the way their leaves turn up towards the sun. for nourishment. And Ben is going to be sharing with us all about trees for soil health and resilience. And he is also the head of agroforestry of the Soil Association in the UK, which I'm really excited to be amplifying. The Soil Association does amazing work, and they have like their resources and for farmers and gardeners is deep and wide. So if you're looking for resources and you're over in that area of the world, then be sure to check them out. Globally, you can check them out too. Of course, they're awesome. And Ben has been commercial growing for over 30 years. And he started his career growing vegetables for chefs. And he's really specialized in understanding and being curious about how trees can amplify and help us grow healthier crops that are disease resistant, pest resistant, and also build our soil health. And he's an author. He has a couple of awesome books out. One is the Woodchip Handbook, and the other one is Silvohorticulture. And the Silvohorticulture is your newest book, right, Ben?
Silvohorticulture.
So Silvohorticulture, sorry.
Yeah, can't say the horti bit.
Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Silvohorticulture book.
Yeah.
Silvohorticulture is Ben's newest book, and what I love about it, Ben, is that it's really thorough, and it's published by Chelsea Green, who puts out amazing books, and it not only really goes into like the system design and the interactions of trees with crops and the practical benefits, but you also give different species of trees that people might want to use, and you take us through a lot of different practical solutions of what we can do and not do, and things to to avoid and stuff like that. So I just want to give that book a shout out and encourage you to go check it out if you're looking to figure out how to integrate agroecology into your practices, which I'm guessing you do because you're here. So on that note, welcome Ben Raskin to the Soil Summit, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's yeah, delightful to be here. I'm going to try and see if I can work out the technology and get my
yeah. So while you're doing that, I'm just going to share with everyone how this is going to go. So Ben's going to share a slideshow with us. And I think his slideshow will hijack your screen, so it'll be the main picture up there. And then as he goes through that, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. And we usually ask questions at the end, but sometimes we pepper them in throughout the session as well. So be sure to ask them as they come up, and if we don't get them in his presentation, we'll move into them near afterwards and towards the end. Sound good? Thumbs up?
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks so much,
you, Ben.
Natalie.
I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, so yes, trees, soil health and resilience. I mean, you did a rather wonderful job of introducing me, but I thought, hang on, is that going forward? Oh, no. Oh, there we go. Right, so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what I'm up to at the moment. So mostly as Natalie said, I work as Head of Agroforestry at the Soil Association. That's sort of about 3/5 of my day job. I also work for Helen Browning. So she is, as well as being the Chief Executive of the Soil Association, she also runs her own 1,500-acre farm. She's the second generation of a 3-generation tenancy. It's owned by the Church of England. You probably, I don't know if you have similar things elsewhere, but in the UK, a lot of land is owned by a small number of big institutions, and the Church of England is one of them. So Helen, about 10 years ago, decided she wanted to do more agroforestry on the farm. Because we've been working on it together at the Soil Association, she asked me if I wanted to manage that for her. So for about half a day a week, I manage the agroforestry planning and planting and care, so the trees on about 200 acres of her farm. And then I do write some books. So the Silvohorticulture, which is the one that came out a couple of weeks ago, I co-wrote with an incredible grower called Andy Dibben, who I would highly recommend you getting on this maybe next year. He's inspirational communicator. He's sort of one of the UK garden grower rock stars. He's brilliant, and I've worked with him over, well, probably 15 years now, and really love doing that book with him. And a lot of the stuff that I'll talk about today comes out of that book as well. And then I do as well just a little bit of private consultancy on the side when I can find the time, which is not always. Yes, as Nancy said, my background is commercial veg growing. You didn't say veg, do you, in America? We had all this big conversation about the title of the book, and we wanted to call it Trees and Veg. But apparently in America, veg just means sitting on the sofa doing nothing. So we went for horticulture instead. So yeah, so I was a vegetable grower, mainly for chefs, but also for farmers markets and box schemes and things. And I now really am mostly interested in trees and how they integrate into farming and the benefits they bring. So what I thought I would talk about today is I sort of do a little bit of an introduction to agroforestry. I'm sure looking at all of this sort of stuff on chat, a lot of you I'm sure will know a lot of this anyway, but I thought it's always good sometimes just to frame it. Then I'll drill down a little bit into how trees specifically affect soil, and then the sort of the wider benefits of trees to the system. So a lot of that is still soil connected, but there's some real benefits, other benefits that trees can bring to your system. I mean, whether you're vegetables or livestock, I have mostly focused on vegetables, but I do work with livestock as well, so I'm happy to cover that if people have questions. And then, although again, so one of the main outputs you can get from trees that then also benefit soil is the wood chip. And obviously, having done quite a lot of stuff on wood chip, I thought that was quite useful to cover as well. So that's my plan. So starting off with what agroforestry is, and I tend to think of it as the deliberate integration of trees into farming, because most farms have at least one tree on them. There are some farms over on the east of England. I'm in the southwest of England, which is lots of trees and quite wet and warm. But over on the east of England, there's some bigger farms with no trees. And I'm sure there's some areas over on your side of the pond that don't have any trees. But most farms, I would say, have at least one tree. But I would say most farmers don't see the value of those trees to their farm. They might like trees, they might appreciate trees, but they don't always see the benefits that those trees are bringing to their farming systems, although that is changing a bit. And of course, it's not a new concept to do this stuff. It's just that we've forgotten it. It's 200 years ago, most of our farms probably would have been practicing agroforestry. They wouldn't have called it that, but that's what it would have been. And there are areas of the world, Southeast Asia, for instance, or, bits of South America, that it's just normal. Every farm is an agroforestry farm, so you don't really have to talk about it. So part of it is sort of us industrialized nations forgetting nature and how it works and thinking we could do it better, and we've now got to rediscover it. So what I try to encourage farmers to do is to think about whether trees might be part of the solution for whatever their problem is. And sometimes there might not be a tree that is going to offer anything, but at the moment, I would say a lot of farmers still just don't think of trees as part of their farm. They think of it as separate. Or at worst, they think of it as something that gets in the way and has to be, is a cost. You've got to trim your hedges, you've got to drive around the trees in your field, and they're just a bit difficult. So it's shifting the value that we put on trees from something at best neutral, at worst negative, into something that's really positive. And there's certainly plenty to be positive about, as I'm sure everyone here today would agree with. And a lot of it for me is around the maximizing of effectively our free resources. So as farmers or gardeners, we have sunlight and we have rain and we have soil. Once you've got those, once you've got some land, effectively all of those are free. You don't have to pay anything extra for it. So how do you make the most of that? And very often, sun is falling onto bare soil, and being reflected back up into the air. So that's wasted sunlight and energy. Rain runs off your farm and down the track or wherever it goes. That's wasted water. And if your soil's not functioning properly and not biologically active, then it's not able to deliver all the stuff that your plant or animal needs. So that's where I start, is how do we make the most of what effectively is given to us for nothing. And then the other bit is thinking about how plants grow. And typically annual crops and grass will grow somewhere between nothing and 2 foot tall, and that is reflected in what's underground. So if you can get plants that are bigger above ground, they tend to be bigger below ground, and therefore you're making better use of the soil. Often, if you've got a deep topsoil, you can get the roots to grow deeper. So you're making better use of not just the soil that you're growing in, but soil that you might not have been using at all before. And there are ways of pushing the tree roots down into the lower bits of the soil and still growing crops on the top, if you choose your cultivation methods and your tree species wisely. And then the other bit really is around holding on to some of those nutrients, particularly that get leached out when it rains. And no matter how good your soil is and how healthy your soil is, if you get long periods of rain, you're going to lose nutrients. And the more you can absorb into it, the more you can spread that water going down further rather than sort of just running off the top layers, the more you can hold on to. And then when it stops raining, it can all get sucked up again. So it's using trees in a way to capture as much of that as possible. And then the other bit, which sort of isn't quite shown on the slide, is around around how long plants can capture light. So typically our annual crops might only be in the ground for 6 months or 5 months, whereas a tree will come into leaf typically earlier than annual crops and will stay in leaf later. So it's capturing sunlight for a much longer period of time. So again, you're the more light you can intercept before it hits the ground, the better, because that's basically building fertility for you, and then you have a choice of how you manage that fertility afterwards. So you got the sort of the above ground bit and the below ground bit, and then working out how all of that interacts with your other bits of the system, your animals and your plants. That's the sort of tricky, interesting bit in a way. And this is just, I love this slide because it's based on an actual excavation that was done of some trees. And the one on the right is typically what the roots of those trees will do in a forest plantation where there's no cultivation. You plant, and once they're established and nothing's growing underneath, that's how they grow. And then on the left is a arable agroforestry system where they've been root pruning and cultivating that top layer. And you can see effectively you've got a similar amount of root mass of those trees, but that you've got effectively what they call the arable crop root zone. So you've got effectively 2 or 3 feet of soil that you can grow your arable crop in above the level of the plantation. And while there might be some competition, particularly around the edges, in most situations, the overall yield of that will be higher than if you were growing them individually. And this leads to this term, which I'm sure some of you have come across, which is the land equivalence ratio. And broadly what that means, this very technical diagram that you can see here, this came from our Agroforestry Handbook that we did a few years ago, which is, we're actually working on a second volume of that, which we hope to have ready by the end of the year. But this one's still available as a download from our Soil Association website. So basically the broad concept is that diverse systems are pretty much always more productive than less diverse systems. So if you grow one crop on its own, it's not going to do as well as if you grow 2 crops together, or better still is 3 or 4. And Darwin recognized this centuries ago. This is not a new concept. But effectively in this fictitious example, you've got your crop A, which is walnuts, and you grow a hectare of it, and you have whatever your 100% expected yield of walnuts is, and then you've got your 1 hectare of wheat and your 100 of that. So you would think that if you grew 1 acre with, half an acre of wheat and half an acre of walnuts, you would expect you'd get half of each yield maybe, but actually you get probably something like 80% of the yield and 40% of the walnuts. So overall you get 120% of the yield. And typically agroforestry systems are 20-30% at least more productive. Now you still have to be able to make a living out of that productivity, that sort of biomass in a way. So it doesn't mean that just because it's producing a lot, you can sell as much. So you've still got to choose the right crops and have markets for them and be able to harvest them. But just in terms of the amount of biomass that comes out of the system, these diverse treed systems are almost always more productive. And that's what's exciting for me. And because I come from a commercial world, how do you translate that power of nature effectively and that power of diverse systems? How do you translate that into something that we can make more money out of, so that farmers can survive and do well while supporting nature? That's sort of what drives me. And the next slide, I'm not going to do very many of this sort of slide, you'll be pleased to hear, because there's a lot of detail on that. But this is effectively so that LER, the land equivalence ratio that I showed on the last slide. This study looked at 277 sort of horticultural based intercropping systems, so diverse systems, and 251 of those were more productive than 100% of the monocrop. So that's pretty amazing. And if you look at so can you see my cursor sort of there, so that's where the 1 is. So that's anything on the left of that line was worse than growing a single crop, and anything on the right was more productive. And so the average they looked at was, again, around 30%. That's where the bulk of them are. But you can also see that some of these systems were twice as productive. So they were getting double the production effectively of a single crop, or even 2.5 times some of them were. And 277 is a lot of measures to be reading. So I thought that was quite powerful. I think we're sharing this presentation, Natalie, afterwards, aren't we? So the link to this will be in there. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to get it right, but the potential is there. And then just to round off the sort of the agroforestry introduction bit, as I said, the broad definition is this deliberate integration of trees into farming. And then within that, you've got a whole range of ways of classifying those. So typically there's cropping systems, which there could be silvo-arable, there could be silvohorticultural, food forests. I think I saw in the chat, there's a couple of people with food forests. Food forests are probably the most productive way of producing food, but they're really hard to make work commercially and efficiently. And so I see a lot of what I do around sort of often alley cropping systems, but sort of more commercial systems is almost like a slightly simplified version of those food forests, and taking some of the principles of that and of permaculture and trying to make it work for larger farmers. And then on the livestock side, the silver pastoral, as they're usually called, you've got all kinds of ways of bringing that in. You've got woodland grazing, shelter belts, browsing blocks, single trees, alleys, hedges, and so on. In the UK, there's a lot of hedges, and a lot of them are not being maximised for the production, and certainly not for animals. So there's quite a big job in the UK, I would say, to shift how we manage our hedges, and it's quite an easy win rather than having to go out and plant lots of new trees and so on. That hedge that you're currently trimming to 1 metre by 1 metre could be left to grow bigger and would be more beneficial to you, as well as cost you less money. So that's agroforestry. As I said, I'm going to mostly probably focus on the sort of horticultural systems, partly because I've got the new book out and some nice illustrations that Kate Verity did for us, and partly it's most of my expertise. But I'm very happy to answer questions. If people have got a specific livestock question that comes up, then I'm very happy to touch on that. And this is an example of what a diverse horticultural system might look like, where you've got these shrub layers, field layers, and ground layers with different types of tree and size of tree and ways of pruning them. But we'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. So, any questions at this stage, Natalie, or shall I keep going?
I think keep going. You're answering a lot of my questions as you're going through, so it's awesome. I am really enjoying this.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to before we even get to the thing, I'm going, right, is your soil good enough to plant trees? And I don't know if it's the same with you, but we periodically have sort of grants that have come out for tree planting, and typically farmers will go, oh yeah, that corner of the field that's too wet to do anything else with, I'll put some trees in that. And then they're slightly surprised that they don't do that well, or that they still can't use it. And often, if you're moving from what has been quite a heavily cropped situation, so an arable farm or a horticultural area that's been very well worked and harvested, then actually the soil might be quite impoverished and certainly won't have very much fungi in. And I'm sure that I know you've got Elaine Ingham and others speaking. There's that fungal bacterial ratio in your soil is even more important for trees. They like fungi. They do well in fungi. Tree systems are fungal systems, and often if you're planting trees into land that haven't had trees for a while and that has been cultivated a lot, they won't have a lot of fungi in. So it's worth thinking about that before you even plant them. How do you build that and make sure that the soil is ready and will grow trees well? And I would say composted wood chip is a really good way to start that, and we'll sort of kickstart that process for you. But you might also want to add compost and other things, and just make sure that you've got a really good soil that the trees are going to thrive in. And then we think about, in a way, what happens once you so I'm just shifting your faces around because it's covering up some of my notes. So then once you actually plant the trees, and this is a picture actually of one of our browsing blocks that we put in a few years ago. The first thing that a tree will do, whether it's a tree seed that germinates or whether we're planting a sapling, is that those roots will need to start developing, and the little white roots will start pushing themselves out. And once the leaves come out, they'll start pushing photosynthesizing and pushing some of those carbohydrates out through the roots and feeding the soil. So right from the start, they're going to be interacting with the soil, and it's almost like I sometimes think of it like when I remember when my child first went to nursery, and it's like it's a being that had just been in our house. So it's like your tree that's in the nursery. It hasn't had any. It had contact with the outside world, but it hadn't had contact with a forest of children. And then suddenly you put it in there, and they're quite shy to start with, and they're sort of tentatively making friends. And then as they get more confident and they grow and they become established, they have their networks of friends, and they talk to the older children, which are the old trees, and all of that. So it's that building of your tree's confidence effectively. But if there's too much competition initially, and things are too, if the grass is really vigorous, that's kind of like the bully that comes in and knocks your child's confidence. So you do need to nurture in those early couple of years. You need to nurture your tree, and really, you might want to break up a bit of compaction in the soil if it's not great, or you definitely want to mulch it and keep the weeds away for the first couple of years. And then as it grows, I don't know how long I can keep this analogy going, by the way, but as the tree grows, then obviously you're getting more and more photosynthesis happening. The leaf area is increasing. The canopy grows. The more sugars are going into the soil to feed the soil life. And then the other bit, particularly where you're talking about arable and horticulture in the cropped soils, the main thing that happens is we stop cultivating that bit of soil. And the one thing that fungi love is uncultivated soil. Now, and I'm guessing that within this community, spraying is not something that's done very often, or certainly not spraying with fungicides. But it is something, you know, I work with quite a lot of farmers who might be using some fungicides on their cereal crops, or they've taken over land where it's been used. And of course, the one thing that fungicides do is kill fungi. So as soon as you stop spraying, you stop cultivating, and you feed this soil, then suddenly the fungi is going to really get going. And so you end up under your trees, whether it's a clump of trees or rows of trees, you end up with this rich fungal network that starts growing. And it's estimated that those fungi will sequester as much carbon as the tree that's growing in them. So there's massive potential to build your soil under there. And of course, they all start then connecting with other bits of fungi, and they can transport nutrients all around the place. I think of them a little bit as the road network. You know, they can pull in stuff from wherever it's being produced, and they massively increase the area that your tree can access nutrients from. So thinking about not just the fungi around your trees, but how can you link those fungi and those trees to other trees nearby? So in this picture, you know, that's obviously a very long established group of trees there. Is there a way that you could connect your new trees up with those trees, and then all of those fungi could pass nutrients and messages to each other through, because they do communicate through it as well. So it's thinking about what's happening under the soil as your tree grows, I think is quite useful, and sort of really thinking about the long-term arc in a way, of sort of from a seedling, what's it going to be, and what are the stages that it go through, and what it needs. And this is so again, this is one of Kate's pictures, and it's so complicated, isn't it? As soon as you try and illustrate what happens in a soil, it gets very hard. But I quite like this. And you start off here, sort of in the middle, with this photosynthesis, and that's what drives it all. You know, all of us depend on the sun's energy. So how does the tree build that? Well, 50% of it or so is going into building carbon and nutrients that let the tree grow. And then 50% of it goes into the roots. And then a lot of that is actually, maybe half is going out as root exudates to feed soil life and to trade for the nutrients that a tree can't make itself. And in a way, the closer you can get with your vegetable crops or your livestock, the more that's able to interact and you're able to make use of it. Now, of course, you then got the balance. If you get particularly a big tree like this illustration shows, if you got too close to it, then actually nothing much would grow underneath. So there is a balance, and you've got to work out, you know, how big your tree is and how you're going to manage it. But that sort of cycling of carbon, you know, then you can see at the bottom, it's getting taken up as, you know, into the organic matter gets sort of taken into the soil life. The nutrients are getting released back and forwards from the crops, and leaf drop is contributing to that as well. So it's all very complex, but effectively a combination of the leaf drop and the exudates into the soil are what drives that soil health benefit of trees to me. And working out how you do that in a way that complements and doesn't compete with your other farming enterprise or gardening, you know, gardening crops is the key. And then the other thing then just to think about in terms of that soil life is, because of all of that increased organic matter that we're getting, if we get it right. And it's also worth bearing in, sort of understanding in a way how far from the tree you're having an impact on the soil, because the tree leaves, well, they might get blown a bit towards, you know, away from the tree, but they'll mostly be falling fairly near the tree. And the fungi will mostly still be limited fairly near the tree, because probably we're going to be cultivating in between or near them. So there might still be areas of your garden or farm that aren't getting all of that benefit. And over time, they will become better and better, but they might take longer to become better. So, and we'll come on to this with Woodchip in a way, but how can you accelerate that process and make sure that you sort of maximize the how far from the tree you're getting the benefits? So we talked about that fungi bacterial ratio as well. The other interesting bit with sort of climate change and all of that is there is some evidence showing that when you get elevated CO2 levels in the air, then actually some trees invest extra money, extra energy into building associations with mycorrhiza that scavenge deep nutrients. So there seems to be a sort of inbuilt mechanism potentially within a lot of trees to react and not just photosynthesize more, but also to build those relationships that will support with other nutrients from the soil. So that's, there's still so much of this we don't know. I think we've identified, what, 10% of the organisms that live in our soil. So there's still a long way to go to fully understand it. But nature, I think, does potentially have ways of compensating for all the awful mistakes we make. So that's soil. So I thought I would just cover a couple of other bits, so things like water and wind and things. So water, I don't know, because you've seen to do a lot of you from everywhere. So I'm not, there's not going to be a kind of typical farm, I don't think, of everyone listening, is there? But certainly I'm in the southwest. I'm not in the far southwest of England. I'm sort of I'm on the most easterly bit of the southwest of England. So I'm wet, but I'm not quite as wet as Cornwall or West Wales, if any of you know those areas where it mostly rains all the time. But this picture is unfortunately not atypical. It's a maize field on a slope, and it hasn't been undersown, so it's been harvested probably in sort of late-ish fall, sort of, which for us is October, November time, and because you have to go in late, often the soil conditions aren't great when you're harvesting it, so they probably messed up the soil a bit when they were harvesting, and then the rains came, and as you can see, they're losing probably quite a lot of their field down into the waterways, causing problems for the river and also losing their asset, which seems a little short-sighted, but unfortunately not atypical. So planting trees is one way of slowing that down. It might not necessarily stop it, but if you had a couple of rows of trees across there, it would definitely help. And there's loads of studies that have looked at some of this stuff and shown the benefits that agroforestry systems bring to runoff. This one is a French study looking at nitrate leaching. So that sort of big red one is the agriculture, so average agriculture kilograms per hectare per year that's lost, and forestry is just over 10, and agroforestry is much closer to forestry than it is to agriculture, so around half of agriculture. And there's similar results can be shown for things like phosphate leaching, for particulates. It massively reduces almost all of them. So not only reduces the volume of water coming off the land, but also the quality of the water. So actually I've talked quite a lot really about the nutrient side. It's worth saying as well that it's not just a question of quantity of nutrients. So you've got the leaf fall and you've got your fungi building up and all the rest of it. But one of the things that seems to happen once you introduce trees into the system is you get better cycles and you get better utilization of those nutrients. So the plants that you grow in between are able to make better use of what is in the soil. And we often get, if we're working with a highly intensively farmed arable system, for instance, and they'll have their chemical soil test done, they go, oh, but you haven't got enough of potassium or whatever it is. But once they get the biology working, actually it's plenty. It's just that they haven't been able to access any of it, and so they've had to add more because their soil was so biologically inactive that their plants couldn't get it. And trees again help to fast track that biological cycling and utilization, or seem to. This is one of this is not an out of focus blurry photo. This is over on the other side of England where it's quite dry. There are bits of it that are classed as arid, And you might not think that England is big enough to have such different climates, but there are bits of the southeast that get almost no rainfall. And this is one of them. And this is the soil blowing away. This is very light, peaty soil. And, you know, in the same way that our watery farmer was losing it into the river, this farmer is losing it over the hedge and off into the North Sea. So you may have come across a farmer called Stephen Briggs, who's a pioneering arable agroforestry farmer. And his main motivation for planting trees was to stop the soil blowing away. And I was quite interested. I was reading I can't remember which one of the Steinbeck novels recently, and they talk about planting eucalyptus to stop wind blowing away. So, you know, it's again nothing new, but we forget, don't we? We forget history. So yeah, slowing the wind down is really useful. And there's so many benefits to it. And you know, you'll be aware of a lot of this, but you know, there's the soil erosion bit. Typically the temperature when you in the shade or shelter of a tree is 4 or 5 degrees warmer. So that enables you potentially to plant crops out earlier, to grow crops that might not quite be suitable. So for instance, for us in the UK, butternut squash, just a little bit, you can grow them, but they don't always come good. But actually, if you can get them out 2 weeks earlier and it can be a bit warmer for the whole season, then suddenly that might turn that crop into something that's worth growing rather than something that really only works once every 3 years. So there's some real benefits, and even stuff like pollinators and predators are more likely to be active and will be active for longer in a protected situation than they are in full wind. And Andy, who I wrote the book with, found one out recently, which is even more mind-blowing, is that a flower will hang on to its nectar for longer and be attractive to bees for longer if it's not getting blown about. So therefore, you're increasing your pollinators just by having the flowers last longer. And it kind of makes sense, actually. You see blossom being blown off, but actually, even when it stays on and is just windy and rocked, then it will destroy more quickly. So just slowing everything down is quite useful. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen a version of this type of diagram. It's about, you know, the design of your windbreak. So at the top, you've got a solid, effectively evergreen windbreak that acts a bit like a wall. And you can often end up with more damage there because the wind spirals back over and cyclones around on the other side. So what you really want is a nice permeable mixed species windbreak, preferably different heights, as well as sort of deciduous stuff, and then you can manage it by pruning some at different times. And there's a chap in the UK called John Davis who's been doing some stuff which he calls the optimal shelter belt design, and it actually looks at, you start low, go high, and then go low again. And if you get it right, it pushes the air higher, effectively, slows it down and pushes it higher and keeps some of the warmer air lower. So you can make a real difference, particularly for livestock in spring. It can make a massive difference. I haven't got a link to him in there, but I can send you one later. He's written a really good paper. And then thinking about that in terms of this sort of multi-year cropping type situation, you can start to see how, particularly in horticulture, you end up with some very complex designs. So this is showing where you've got a coppiced, 5-year coppiced system. So that might be hazel or willow or something. And over the years, how protected it is from wind, for instance. But you can do similar diagrams for light. And there's just a couple of, when you're designing particularly alley cropping systems, there's a couple of formula that's sort of worth bearing in mind. One is this: the height of the tree times 10. So effectively, if you get your design right on your windbreak, you should get 10 times the height of the windbreak as an effective sort of beneficial area behind that. So if your trees are 2 meters tall, then you should be getting a reduction in wind speed for 20 meters beyond that. And then the other bit, which is more to do with light, is you don't really want your alley to be any less than 2 times the height of the tree, or you just won't get enough light through it, probably. But again, you can change either by coppicing or other forms of pruning. You can change height at different times of year, but it's worth sort of minimum and maximum in a way, if you like. And then the other thing, obviously, just think about is if you're on a slope, then wind will have a different effect. So the wind benefit for a tree there is going to be almost nothing, whereas if the tree's coming down, you'll have a wind effect that probably travels down to the bottom. And every farm and every situation is different. So thinking about sort of how that wind works. And then this is this is an example. This is Wakeland's farm, which is a pioneering agroforestry farm in the UK. Martin Wolf, who's sadly no longer with us, but inspiring man to many of us. And this is a double hazel row where they coppice one every year. So you've always got some windbreak, and you sort of effectively, it's really easy to manage. You just spin down and coppice one side, and then the following year you coppice the other. And they were growing wheat and potatoes and things in between, as well as keeping chickens. But there's an infinite way of managing the trees within the system, but it's thinking about what you want them to do and how to achieve it. And I just thought it was worth, because you have, when you're planning to integrate trees into farming, you have a lot of objectives. And then you go, right, I really wanted to do X, Y, and Z, and these are the crops I want to grow. And then you look at your field and you go, oh, that doesn't work. So typically for light in the Northern Hemisphere, they recommend planting north to south because you get light on both sides. We'll come on to it. But then you go, okay, so I've got a field here. So this is one of the fields at Eastbrook Farm where I work, where it's had quite a nice square field, not quite square, but nearly square. And our prevailing winds come from the southwest. So they sort of fire up across the ocean and come in from the southwest. And then we do occasionally get some nasty northeast winds as well. So those are the 2 winds that I want to protect most from. And pretty much north-south, and that works because I've got nice long rows and I'm protecting from the wind. So that's perfect. Great, I can do that. And then I looked at another field on the farm, and I'm going, okay, so I've got this very long, thin field that effectively, if I was going to, I probably only would put 2 or 3 rows of trees in there. And from a practical point of view, I would want them running up and down because I don't want to be up and down and back and forth on little short rows all the time. But that would give me, it would give me not just no wind protection, it's worse, it actually funnels through the rows of trees if you plant them. So the alternative would be to plant them across like that all the time, which just would be a right old pain to manage. So probably then I'd go, well, maybe that's not the field to plant agroforestry in. So you do have to look at the other bits of what's going on in your field to work out the best way to arrange it. And this was our solution in one field. So this is a sort of odd shaped field. This was the first one actually that Helen and I planted up. And it's a weird shape. Obviously, sort of a chunk was cut out of it at some point there, and something happened up there. And we thought, well, there's no obvious way of doing the alleys. And actually, we're not going to harvest. We're not cropping in this field. It's going to be a silvopoultry system. And so we've just done it with curved rows, which looks lovely. And you when you're in the middle of it, it's just glorious. And Helen just said, well, just make it beautiful and let's not worry too much. You can still drive. It's 10 meter space, 10 meter gap between the rows. So you can still drive the tractor down them and cut hay. But it's so that was our solution in that. So you can be imaginative as well. And this is not contour planted, by the way. This is just a flat site. But obviously that's another thing to bear in mind. If you're on a slope, then trying to sort of capture or work with the slope is tricky as well. So that's wind. Any questions, Natalie, or are we good? Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Excellent. Right, so I thought I'd move on to sunlight. And this is definitely not a picture from the UK. This is far too hot and bright and sunny. Um, but again, it's one of the interesting things you get when you talk to farmers or gardeners about planting more trees. They go, "Oh, but I don't want to lose all my growing land. I don't want to cut out all the light." Actually, most plants don't need uh, as much light as you think, and a lot of crops will grow without full sun. But we are aiming for that sweet spot between not enough, where you get weak spindly plants, you get an imbalance between foliage and roots. They tend to be very vulnerable to pests and disease because they're sort of growing too much and stretching out their cells, and typically you get lower yields if you don't have enough sun. But equally, too much sun is also a problem, and particularly too much really hot sun. And we're certainly getting more frequent periods of really hot, dry weather in the UK. And then, you end up with scorched leaves and fruit with wilting. And actually, even before you see some of that, this irregular transpiration will lead to heat stress and cell death, and they'll be suffering quite a long time before you see them suffering. And you might end up with lower yields, even though they look all right and they seem to be producing all right. You could well end up with lower yields than you would have been able to get. And there's a few principles in a way when you're designing a system to think about. And I've got a slide for sort of each of these in a way, but so the fact is, different crops need different levels of light. So actually just having everything in the middle of a field in full sunlight, it might be what you have to do because that might be what you've got. But actually, if you can make your system more complex and provide the right amount of light for different crops, then that can work well. Then different trees cast different levels of shade. So a tree is not a tree is not a tree. And look at the habit and also the leaf shape. So for instance, we've got, oh, crap, I don't mean to go on so quickly to that. We've got one field where we've planted, it's actually that field with the curved lines. We've got almonds and we've got apricots in 2 rows next to each other. So they're both prunus, so you would think maybe they would behave similarly. But the apricots are really spreading and they've got really dense foliage and almost nothing grows underneath them. So I interplanted them with some gooseberry bushes that are just not growing at all. Whereas the almonds are quite upright in growth and they've got quite a fine sort of pinnate leaf. And so actually quite a lot of light gets through to the bottom, and the raspberries under there are growing really well. So really sort of observe the tree and observe the habit and potentially prune to alter the levels of shade. The other bit is the change over the season bit. So the amount of shade that is cast by a tree will change with the season. So obviously if it's deciduous, in the winter, it's not really casting any shade to speak of. And then in midsummer, it will be casting quite a lot. So is there a way of adapting which crops you grow at which time? And then obviously layout of trees is a key factor. And then thinking about climate change and what that will do, not just to light levels, but about what your plants might need. So is it going to be that because we're getting really long periods of dry, hot weather occasionally, you need to be more thoughtful as this, where in the past it might not have mattered. So if you sort of there's 3, and this isn't foolproof because it will vary, but broadly speaking, there's 3 types of plant when you look at light levels. There's leafy stuff, which can manage even on less than 4 hours of full sunlight, and that's pretty true of almost every leafy bit. They're quite happy in semi-shade. They like a bit of sun. You don't want to plant them in the dark, but they definitely cope with quite a lot of shade. You've got your sort of rooty stuff. I use that very broadly, which probably need 4 to 6 hours of full sun, but definitely don't need all day. And then you've got things that are grown for their fruit. So that might be tomatoes or maize, corn, that sort of stuff. The fruity bit is the bit you eat, and they are the ones that need the most sun. So if you're thinking about where you plant stuff and what you can put near a tree and what you might not be able to, that's quite a nice rule of thumb. And then, so I mentioned this sort of apricot almond thing in terms of the different trees. There's also there's ways of pruning it, so you can coppice or pollar. So coppicing is where you take the tree right down to the ground, usually every, say, 3 to 5 years, but it depends on what you're using it for in the species. But then you can also grow really small trees. And a colleague of mine saw in Italy, they saw a big field of fava beans, and they'd been periodically, they'd planted a single step over row of apples all the way up the field at sort of every 30 meters. So they weren't really, I would say, giving them very much shade or shelter, but they were definitely a biodiversity benefit, and they were getting an extra crop. So you can be really imaginative in terms of how you include them and how much shade it is, but you just need to, you need to think about it in a way and understand the effect that different level of shade will have on your crop. And then this is quite, so Andy spent a lot of time with spreadsheets and charts and things getting this right. So this is at London. So if you're sort of on a similar latitude to London, then this will be you, but a similar chart could be done wherever you are. And it's looking at the different amount of shade that you'll get on the north side of a tree at different times of year. So at the summer solstice, you'll get 4 meters of really dense shade on the north side, right through to the winter solstice, where you'll get 17 meters of, assuming it's a deciduous tree, you'll be getting 7 meters of less dense shade, and everything in between. But if you think about something like garlic, which will have done most of its growing by, then actually you could plant that really near the tree and it won't be affected by the shade at all. And by the time the tree comes out into leaf, it's done its growing, doesn't need a lot of sun. And it might even be, you might have pulled it out of the ground by the time the tree's really fully in leaf. So you can be quite clever about where you put stuff if you understand how much shade there's going to be over the year. And all, by the way, all of these diagrams are in the Silvohorticulture book. So Kate's just such a good job, I think, of bringing it to life, because it's a sort of thing, if I tried to explain it with words, you all go, what's that? Angles of 4 meters. Anyway, but picture says 1,000 words, doesn't it? So this again is looking at sort of different orientations, south and north, east and west, and what that will do in terms of shade and full sun. But of course, if you plant a small tree, you can basically have full sun everywhere. And for a lot of garden situations, I think smaller trees probably are the answer, and will give you a lot of the benefits without creating too many problems. And then similar to the wind, if you're on a slope, the shading will be affected by the slope. So you'll have not very much shading on the south side. But what that does mean potentially is that you can, I mean, that obviously is a steeper slope than you would plant vegetables on, but it means that you can plant trees and be less affected by shading than you would be on a flat bit of ground. So potentially opens up other opportunities. So, how are we doing for time? Are we good for time?
Yeah. Yes, we're good for time. Yeah. Yeah, I would really like to make sure that we get into some Q&As, but I'm
three-quarters of the way through the slides.
Okay, we have about 30 minutes before we're scheduled to wrap.
I'll speed up.
Okay. Awesome.
Right. So this, I would say this is really important, because Andy and I both, when we started writing the book, we thought, right, what does a tree root look like? And we both of us looked at that left-hand one and we thought, something like that, isn't it? It's sort of heart-shaped and you got some stuff out the side and a big deep tap root. And actually, there are some species that have a system a bit like that. but they're the rarity. 80% of trees have a root system that, like the one on the right. And so once you start, it doesn't matter if you're doing it into a livestock system. It doesn't really matter where the roots are because it's just under grass. But if you're starting to put them into cropping systems, it's really worth knowing that they will send most of them out sideways. And really, unless you have very wide tree rows within your alleys, you do want to be root pruning and pushing those roots down a bit, as we saw at the beginning. So that's definitely something just to sort of have in the back of your mind, that not the most, what trees often do, they'll send down a taproot. So when they germinate or when we replant them, they'll send down a taproot to anchor themselves. And so we then think, oh, well, then they're just sending that taproot down further and further. Quite often that's just a young stage effectively. And once it's established, once it's got a grip on itself, then it sends out the lateral ones. So that's definitely worth thinking about. And I've talked about root pruning, so we can probably skip over that one. Yeah, think about how deep you want your crops to grow. I mean, you may not have an option. Andy's soil is only, I think, 2 foot deep anyway, so he can't go much deeper than that. Whereas the farm that we worked on initially together had 3.5 meters of topsoil, and it was amazing. And you could have gone down as deep as you wanted. So you have to work with what you got. But yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about managing those roots, particularly I would say with prunus species, which send out suckers. There can be a particular problem. And then this idea of phasing in a way is it's the coming together of all of this complexity. So as gardeners, I'm sure, or growers, all of us are aware of this, of what a rotation is and of how you might plan a rotation and think about a rotation. And this effectively is a 3D rotation, where you've also got a complexity of a tree and how that changes over the year and from year to year. So if you plant a small tree for the first year, 3 years, it's going to have no effect at all in terms of light and wind benefit. But as it gets bigger, it will have more and more effect. And then as you saw in some of those coppice systems, you can alter it and you can manipulate that on an annual basis. And how you then integrate vegetables, for instance, into that is infinitely complex. And Alan Schofield, who's a grower who's now retired, who was the book's dedicated to, he's an amazing grower, and he had a 30-year-old agroforestry vegetable system. It was a 5-year older coppice system, and he ended up with this unbelievably complex rotation where he knew year one, that crop did really well in the middle of the row. That year crop he could put near the trees. Year two, it was a totally different group of crops. Year three, so he'd worked out over 30 years what worked near trees, what worked, but it would be different for another farm. He had really rich peaty soil and he was growing a nitrogen fixing tree. If you were on lighter soil with apples, it would be different probably. So there isn't a template that I can give you and go, here, I'll take this and go off and grow. You have to work it out for yourself really and plan it according to what you want to grow and what your site is like. But yeah, I mean, it's just so complex and so interesting. But what this should all give you is a resilient system, basically. So hopefully a diversity of crops and markets will make it financially resilient, but also the resilience of the soil and the farming system. And this is Ian Tolhurst, or Tolly as he's called. This is his farm where he's planted trees and then interplanted with rhubarb, and he had daffodils that he was cutting and selling as well. So you can build all of this complexity, and it makes it a bit more complex to manage, but it means that every year you'll have something. If something goes wrong, it doesn't go wrong with every crop. It goes wrong with 20% of the crops. And as long as it's not the same 20% of the crops every year, you're all right. So if you've got a brain that can deal with complexity and lots of stuff going on, then it will make your farm a better and more resilient place. Right. Let's speed through Woodchip. So you've got trees and you've got your system and it's all working and it's very beautiful. What about when the trees die? And this is a picture of my dear children when they were a little bit younger than they are now. The one on the left is now taller than I am. But obviously in nature, branches fall off, trees fall over, and the branch just sits there, doesn't it? And it eventually gets infected with fungus and insects come and bore into it, and eventually just breaks down and becomes part of the soil and the soil life. And we could do the same, couldn't we, on our farms? We could just let stuff fall off and leave it there. And it would do that job, but it would make life quite difficult to manage, and it would make the farm not very efficient. So we do need to probably find a better way of managing it. This is amazing orchard that I went to see a couple of weeks ago, where they are trying to leave a lot of dead wood in place. They leave some of the trees, if they don't get too much in the way, they leave some of the fallen trees, and their habitat is just astonishing. But it doesn't work, and certainly in crop situations it wouldn't work at all. So what can we do to retain some of that benefit of having all of that wood and those woody materials within the farm? And in a way, I came into a lot of this, certainly the wood chip thing I came into because we were using it as a mulch for planting trees, and I saw the benefit. So if we start looking at mulches, which is possibly, I guess, what most people are most familiar with using wood chips on, the water retention benefit. So this picture was taken probably 3 years ago now, but all the trees that you can see, all the trees in the front of the picture were all planted on the same day with trees from the same nursery, same species. They're literally willows. The ones on the left and the ones on the right are willows, and the ones on the right had an accidental mulch of about 2.5 foot of wood chip. And as a result, they were, when this picture was taken, they were something like 12 foot tall, and the others were still barely past my waist. And I was out there today, actually, and the other ones, we've got to coppice them. They're so big now, and the other ones are still only about 6 foot tall. So it was extra. This was in 2017, 2018. 2018 for us was a really hot, dry year. So it was a really difficult year to plant. We lost quite a lot of trees in that field, but those trees just thrived. And that was sort of one of the kick-starting points for my obsession with wood chip, really, was seeing how those trees survived and thrived. But actually loads of studies show that a decent mulch, so somewhere between 10 and 15 centimeters, which is, what's that in inches, so 4 to 6 inches, as a minimum, will give you about 25% moisture retention, or 25% less irrigation requirements. We now tend to put on more like 10 to 12 inches of wood chip where we can when we're planting new trees, which is a lot, and does take a lot of wood chip, but it means that we don't irrigate, and the trees, we get almost no losses now. So I would recommend more rather than less. There is an element as well of temperature modulation. So most soil organisms don't like it really hot and really cold, and a good mulch will help to keep soil cool in summer and warmer in winter. The other thing is, a few people say, I read it actually mainly, they said, don't put wood chips in your wormeries. Worms hate wood chip. And I thought, I don't know. And this picture, so we get a lot of wood chip delivered by arborists, we call them tree sellers. You call them tree sellers? I don't know what you call them, but anyway, people that go down and chop trees down for people. So we get deliveries of this wood, and we stack it on a concrete standing bay. So this is not sitting on soil. There is not access to worms. And you can see how decomposed this wood chip is. It's still really quite fresh. There's some big lumps still in there. And yet the worms are in there, and they're eating it, and they love it. There's masses of worms in there. And there's loads of studies showing, which are in the wood chip book actually, but showing increases in worm populations where you put wood chip in. And that, that's helping to break up the soil and create aggregates and all the stuff that earthworms do for us. So that's pretty striking. And then the other bit, which we talked about in relation to trees generally, is around the fungi. And effectively what we're doing with Woodchip is we're starting the breakdown process, which allows stuff to come in more quickly. So typically what happens very slowly, and it's fungi that mostly break down wood, because bacteria need too much nitrogen and they don't have the strength to get in through the really tough lignin that wood is. So fungi tends to start the job, and it needs a bit of nitrogen, but much less than bacteria do. And then once it's got in there and started breaking it all up, then the bacteria come in, and then everything else is able to come in. But by chipping it effectively, we're making it really easy for fungi to enter. They don't have to get through the bark. They've got loads of entry points. It speeds up the whole process. And we can then, either if we're putting it on the surface, we don't probably even need to compost it a lot of the time. There's a whole nother discussion probably that I don't have time for around that and around the nitrogen robbing and all of that stuff. But you can either compost it, or if you're just sort of using it as a mulch, put it on, and over time the fungi will come in really quickly, and then you're building your fungal population. And we've seen so many more and diverse fungi since where we've added the wood chip to what we haven't. This is just a slightly mad picture, really, which I think you probably will all appreciate. So this is intensive corn production. It's in the US somewhere, I can't remember where. And they were having a problem with leaching from the system, which might not be surprising looking at the system. And rather than tackle it upstream, they decided to try and deal with the problem by basically creating a huge wood chip. I don't know what you can call it, pit in the corner of the field where a lot of the runoff was coming. And what it shows actually is that it captured something, I can't remember the exact figure, but it captured the vast majority of the nitrogen that was getting leached. And then every couple of years, they dig it out and replace it with fresh wood chip. So whether it's a sensible solution or the right solution to the problem is one thing, but what it does show is the wood chip really holds on to nitrogen and reduces leaching of nitrogen from the soil. And if you've got livestock, then using it as a bedding material rather than straw will not only usually give you cleaner, drier animals, but it will also produce a compost that holds on to the nutrients for longer. So there's studies showing that barley straw compost lost its nutrients much more quickly than wood chip made compost. So it's holding onto your nitrogen, and it's building soil health. So that's that, and then we're nearly there. This is the final bit, closing the circle. So this was a project I was involved in about 20 years ago with a group in Wales, where the farmers were using wood chip for bedding, and then they were composting that material as it came out. And then once it was composted, they were growing their own trees from seed collected on farm, which they were then planting into their hedges and their fields. So this is a lovely full cycle of closed circle stuff. And there's again, the whole other stuff about wood chip as a propagation material, composted wood chip composts and substrates. But for trees, they work just brilliantly. And so you then you start the whole thing again. And that is me done. Thank you very much. And you did say I had to wave the books around as well. So no,
that's right. That's right. Hold it really still right in front of there. You hold it. Let me. Oh, it's not focusing on it yet.
I don't know. Anyway, they're there. Well,
they're there. You can. Oh, there it is. We see it. We see it. Silvohorticulture. Yay! Awesome. And we put some links in the chat. You can get the Silvohorticulture and the Woodchip Handbook at Chelsea Green, and using Ben's coupon code BR30, that's BR30, you can get 30% off of them right now. So go and pick those books up and you can get 30% off. Thank you for that, Ben, so much. And Ben, thank you for that.
I'll stop the sharing at this point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that would be awesome. And let me see a picture of your book right there too. Brilliant and beautiful. And thank you for amplifying Andy's work, because I realize he is also a contributor and author of that book, and I can see how much work and effort you've put into that, not just from a practical perspective, but also the hours of research and
Yeah, it's fun though. I enjoy
learning. Yeah, it's so cool. You know, just quickly, I didn't use wood chips on my strawberries, but I lived in Saskatchewan, and we have like very, very little rain there. And I had about maybe maybe 4 inches, like lots of straw on the strawberries. And the soil underneath of them was completely moist. And it just blew my mind about the power of wood chips, or like mulching. I would have used wood chips, but I didn't have access to them where I was. That was my first choice.
Interestingly, strawberries might be one of the crops that I wouldn't. Well, I'd put composted wood chip, but I wouldn't put fresh wood chip. Basically, if you've got very shallow rooted plants, so things like strawberries, raspberries, I had a problem with, very small seedlings, then you can get a bit of nitrogen robbing just in the surface layer. So if you're going to do something like strawberries, I would use composted wood chip rather than fresh. But
oh, good tip. Thank you for that. Okay, I just want to check in with you, Ben. What do you have 10 minutes, or do you have 15, like to go
I'm
5
good.
over?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm in no rush. Yeah.
Okay, so then anybody who's able to stay on for a bit longer, we'll stay on for for a few minutes longer. We do have another session at the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of that too. And and I want to just get into some questions with Ben, because there's so much here. Another really cool thing you said, Ben, was like you really amplified how planting trees just within other crops helps bring out the strength of those other crops. And when we were, and my dad and I talked about this in his session actually for the Soil Summit this year. And my brother Nicholas is in the room, and he looks after the blueberries at the farm, so he could share this too. But when we planted about 10 acres of blueberries, we planted them, yeah, north to south actually. And one of the ends of the road, like one of the edges of the field, was up against some kind of old growth grove of trees. And I was always curious, because the rows that were closest to there were actually the strongest. They were bigger, they produced more. And now, as we're learning more about the impact of trees, it's just kind of all making sense. So it's so
Yeah,
curious.
I think it does also vary year to year.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if we have a really hot, dry year, the only place the grass is green is under the tree. But then there's other times where it seems to have a negative impact. And so I think it's really hard to predict exactly what's going to do well in every situation. And I think for both Andy and I, when we've looked at it, it's around having as much variation as possible. And Andy talks about he says when he first started planting trees in between his vegetables, he saw it as a nice to have, a thing that would boost his yields a bit, he'd have more biodiversity, and it would all be, it would be great, but he'd be fine without it. Now he says he doesn't think he'd be able to continue with his current yields because of the effects of climate change. He needs trees just to maintain his current yields. And for us, and again, I don't know what you guys are all seeing, but for us, it's just the unpredictability. It could be really strong winds, and it could happen anytime. It could be a period of drought, and it could be in the spring, or it could be in the summer, or we had 27 degrees centigrade, whatever that is in Fahrenheit, at the end of September in 2023. And so we don't know what's coming, and we don't know when it's coming. And trees will buffer the extremes of all of that. And so they just take the pressure off the system that allows us to do something. So
it's amazing. How do tree root exudates affect the soil biology, Ben?
Well, generally they boost it. So it's a general principle, because if effectively plants put out whatever, a third or a quarter of their their energy they give away effectively, or would appear to give away. You'd think, well, why would they do that? Why don't they put it all into new growth, whether that's root or tree growth? And the answer is because although they're amazing, they can photosynthesize, they can't access all the other nutrients that are in the soil. They need potassium, they need arsenic, they need, all of those 132 nutrients or whatever that are good for animal and plant health. So they need to somehow access all of those. And they need to be soluble, and they need to be available, and they need to be near their roots. And the way they do it effectively is they push sugar out through their roots and they trade it. So the roots are like, I mean, if the carrying on from my analogy of the fungi being the transport system, the roots in a way they're the shopping centres or the towns, the market towns or whatever. That's where all the trade happens. So you get these clusters and the high populations of soil organisms around the roots, because effectively they all come and feed. So whether the bacteria come to feed on the exudates and the nematodes come to feed on the bacteria, and so you end up with this incredibly complex thing. And what you get then around the roots is this soup of everything, of nutrients. And because some, like worms, can travel quite a distance, so they'll be bringing stuff from maybe a couple of meters away. And then if you've got the fungi, that might be coming from even half a mile away. And it's all changing and happening, but without the feed, that wouldn't happen near the plant. So effectively, the plant's bribing all of these animals to come and release nutrients near it. And then what we're trying to do, I guess, is capture some of that. And I don't know if the question sort of was then particularly sort of thinking, how do we get it to the crops? Because that's the tricky bit. Because if you're planting the crop right next to the tree, that's fine. It's all part of the same system. But if your crop is, let's say, 30 feet away from the tree and it's not a very vigorous tree, how do you make sure that you're able to capture some of that? And part of that is just making sure your soil is as healthy as possible, leaving plants in for as long as possible. And I know we probably all have a bit of a tendency to tidy up and crop's finished, right? Let's get that out of the ground and on to the next one. And one of the things I learned to do quite early on as a grower was leave brassicas, for instance, as long as possible. So when my kale had finished, rather than thinking, right, I've got to chop it down, I leave it and let it flower, and only take it out at the very last minute. And there's, as well as benefits to things like predatory wasps and things that will overwinter on them, but you're also effectively allowing the soil underneath it and the organisms underneath it to keep that soil as healthy for as long as possible. But ultimately, if we're going to grow stuff, we do have to destroy soil life, and we have to accept the fact that everything we do to soil, is an intervention and is likely to have a detrimental effect. And for me, what the trees do is they allow the bounce back to be much quicker. So the recolonization the recolonization of the damaged soil from the undamaged soil. If you've got more rows of trees all across your field, then they'll be able to recolonize really quickly because they've only got to go a few feet. If you've got one big field and you've just got trails around the edge and they've got to travel 100 feet before they can get to the soil, then it's going to take forever, and some years they might not manage it. So it's it's all about resilience for me with the trees, and whichever way you look at it, it all sort of comes back to that.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the, you did such a good job of giving us some examples and ideas of how to plan what we're planting based on how tall the trees grow and how much shade they provide. And in your book, do you go into some ways to calculate that?
There are. I mean, I shared those couple of formula that I would say there's not necessarily very many ways of calculating it in one sense. So there's the orientation, and that will depend as much on your field and what you want to do as anything else. But broadly, if you can go north to south, go north to south. If you can't, don't worry too much, I would say. Probably avoid direct east to west, but even sometimes that's fine. And then it's really it's all about identifying and prioritizing your objectives. because every farm and every farmer is different.
Right.
So if for instance, if if your main objective is that you want to grow fruit from the trees, then that will determine what species you choose. It will determine probably how big the tree is, when it's going to fruit. Whereas if all you really want is just some windbreak, then that'll be a whole different set of calculations and possibly planting distances. So a lot of my work is helping farmers understand what they want the trees to do, because every tree will deliver a whole range of stuff, but in slightly different ways.
Yeah, and I think the vulnerability is like, what happens if I plant my trees too close together? Or what happens if I plant the wrong crop, or they have too much shade or too much sun? So I'm wondering, what do you see as the biggest mistake people make in when integrating trees into their farms, and how can we fix that?
So possibly, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of the systems are still very young, so I think we don't know a lot of the mistakes yet. So I've found a few of my mistakes, but I'm sure there's more to come. I would say possibly the biggest one might be not adequately planning for how big the tree is going to be. And so that system that I showed you with the double hazels, for instance, Martin said, actually, in hindsight, I would have significantly wider alleys in between. So I can't remember what he's on. He's something like 12 or 14 meters. And he said, I'd go wider. And Tolly, in Tolhurst, where he planted, because he's a woodman as well, and he built his own boat and loves stuff like that. He wanted to grow some timber trees, and actually they were too vigorous for his system and they were too big. So he's now talking about taking them out and replacing them with something smaller. So I think if you're nervous, I think plant every other row initially and see how they go. And if it's working, you can always plant another row in between. And then also just be really aware of how big that tree is going to be and how wide it's going to grow. Because it's sometimes surprising how quickly they grow, and B, how big they might get. So yeah, definitely go out and have a look at some of the trees, and also if you might see a tree in one place and it's not on very good soil, and then your farm might be really lovely and rich, and you're looking after your soil really well, and it grows twice as big. You go, oh, I didn't expect it to be that big. So again, Andy's got one place where he's planted some apples, and he knew that one corner was really kind of a bit wet and icky. So he planted those on a really vigorous rootstock in that corner, and then the ones on the drier soil on a semi-vigorous, and they're all the same size. So you can tweak it, but yes, I would say probably go slightly smaller and slightly further apart if you're worried.
Okay, awesome. I just realized we do need to wrap it up rather quickly, but I want to touch on two or three more questions. Short, I think they're short answers, and then we have just a couple of prizes away. So if you guys want to just hang on for a hot minute, we'll do that as well. So what kind of wood chips are best to use? For example, on apple trees, but just specifically, is there a species that's better than others? Ones we want to avoid?
I can answer that quite quickly, and it's broadly that we don't know. So because very little research has been done on single species wood chip. I mostly use a whole range of whatever the tree surgeon brings in, and it's absolutely fine. The one stuff I have done on is some stuff with willow wood chip, which has salicylic acid in, which seems to stimulate immune reactions in trees, so it can be good for reducing tree disease. You have to get the timing right, but I would say a lot of research needs to be done, and mostly it's quite hard to get hold of single species wood chip. But if you're producing it yourself, you've got a bit more control, but mostly you just take what you're given.
Okay, awesome. And Ben, do berry bushes like currants and hasket berries and gooseberries and even blueberries, do they have the same type of benefits as trees, or is that different?
I would say they do, yeah, absolutely, but obviously on a smaller scale. So yeah, you could easily have a garden agroforestry system that was done with currant bushes, for instance, and that would work, yeah, perfectly well. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And you said we have to prune the roots of the trees. So are there any tree roots that we don't have to prune, or is that something that has to be done yearly, or?
It's really variable. I
Okay.
mean, if you're growing on, say, apples on a dwarfing rootstock, you wouldn't need to because they've got piddly little rootstocks that don't really grow anywhere. But I wouldn't generally recommend growing on dwarfing rootstocks. I think they don't provide a very healthy tree. And then the worst are things like prunus species where they've got these suckers that just come out constantly and sort of fight a losing battle. But again, if you're in a garden and you've got 3 trees, it's fine. You just take a spade to it occasionally, and it works really well. If you're a big orchard, you've got a pruning, root pruner that you can take through. So in a way, it's sort of sometimes it's where you're at the middle scale, maybe where you've got 100 trees and it's not worth investing in a machine, but equally doing it by hand is quite a chore. But yeah, on the vigorous ones, you'd need to do it every year, basically.
There's one question, I thought I kind of asked it, but it came up again. It says, how do you solve the following? Firstly, ripening, if the shade will extend the ripening time. And then if you let the fruit ripen and collect it on the tree, it will ruin the crop under the trees, for example, with the grain. This is possible only by young trees.
Yeah, I think I've understood that. But if I miss it, but yes, I think, yeah, basically, yes, it can be a problem. Leaf falling on salad crops can be a problem, for instance, but fruit falling on crops can also be a problem. So that's where you need to time it right, or not put those crops underneath. I wouldn't probably put crops right up to a tree, but you could put garlic right up to a tree because that would be gone before anything falls off. So it's all about the planning, and it's all about sort of and what's the primary crop? Are you most worried about the apples, or are you most worried about what's underneath? And you can adapt your management and your planning depending on what you really want to get out of it. Because none of this is simple. It's all complex interactions, and everything's happening, and it's slightly different one year. And if the wind's blowing one year, it'll blow everything off one side, and if it's not, it'll drop. And so it's trying to think through all of the different permutations in a way, and you won't think through all of them, but the more that you can think of and adapt your planning to take account of, the better. But yes, it's a complex system, and there will be almost certainly unintended negative consequences as well as all the benefits. So
I think taking the time to read your book would be really helpful for that one.
I agree. Yeah.
And lastly, Ben, and I don't know that you have time to really go into this. If you have resources that you could point us towards, though, that would be amazing. Is to just get your thoughts about leaf mold, using leaf mold in cities for urban waste management, and any thoughts on closed loop systems for parks and that type of thing.
I think leaf mold is a wonderful material. I think there are risks of contamination when you're bringing it in from parks, whether that's if it's coming up from the road sweepings, for instance, you get tire debris in it and goodness knows what else, and I probably wouldn't put that on my garden. If it's just from grass, then you're probably fine. But I also worry that we are robbing those trees of their nutrients and their soil health. If we take everything off, what those trees are going to survive on? And we see a real problem with urban trees losing health and suffering because effectively we're starving them. We take everything off, and we should mostly, I think, we should be mulching that leaf mold back into the grass underneath. And again, there's studies that show that if you just go over it with a mower, it breaks down and goes back into the grass, and the sward does better than if you take it away. So although it is a wonderful material, and if you can get hold of it clean, it's not a bad thing, but equally my gut feeling is we should be leaving it where it is.
Awesome. And Ben, with agroforestry is new to a lot of people, and I'm just curious if you were to suggest a powerful mindset shift that we could embrace to go into new things like agroforestry, for example, what would you say you've noticed has been a common thread of people who've really been able to adapt and to take new ways of farming and gardening on, like agroforestry?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's just a general open-mindedness. I mean, the types of people that I work with are often a new generation coming into the farm. Um, I mean, actually, I'd say they're similar to the type of people that have gone into organics over the decades. A higher proportion of them are women than in traditional farming, I would say, because I think women are often more open-minded and willing to listen. I would say, but you have to be also willing to be laughed at by your neighbours. Most of the farmers that are doing this new stuff are quite happy to be the pioneers, and to do stuff that's a little bit crazy, and they pride themselves on it. There's an amazing farmer called John Pawsey, and I went to see him, I don't know, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. He's probably one of the most successful large scale organic crop farmers, and I was talking to him about the agroforestry we were doing at Helen's, and he was saying, "Oh," he says, "why haven't I put agroforestry in yet? I shall be too late. I'll be too late." And it's like, for him, it was a real problem that he was going to be seen not as one of the pioneers for this. And I think that's the opposite to a lot of farmers who, very nervous about what their neighbours are going to think and about whether they're, what they'll say down the pub. So I think, yeah, it's not a typical farmer, although it's becoming more common.
Very cool. And I just also want to give a shout out to the wood chip thing. We interviewed Blake, who does Korean natural farming. He uses wood chips, and they use wood chips for a no smell pig pen. And he's, I guess, 2 years into his big project now and having a lot of success with it. So, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. I deeply appreciate your wisdom and your insights, and your presentation went way above and beyond I think anyone expected in the room today, and we all learned a lot from your wisdom. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, and I just want to give you can all go and learn more about the Soil Association at soilassociation.org. And Ben Raskin, you can find him at his website at benraskin.uk, and on IG, Instagram at Ben L. Raskin, on YouTube at the Soil Association. They've got a great YouTube channel. And BSKY is the Blue Sky. He is on benraskin.bsky.social, and LinkedIn, you can Google, search him on at Ben Raskin. So thank you, Ben. And thank you to the Soil Association for all the incredible work that you do for us farmers and gardeners and all of life on Earth, really, because it goes way beyond our hands in the soil. We're literally, everyone in this room are literally, you're the change makers. You're the people who are working with this planet every day, hands in the soil and feet on the ground. So thank you for the work that you do. And we have a couple of prizes to give away, don't we, Leslie?
Yes, so this has been fabulous. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Ben. Wow, I'm going to listen to this conversation probably more than once. And it is in the free watch page if you're a free pass holder, and it's in your login. If you're an all access pass holder, there's a course login where you can watch the sessions as many times as you'd like. Those links I have put in the chat, but also you've been getting emails from us. So click the links and rewatch whichever sessions you'd like to revisit. So we have some beautiful regenerative sponsors that sponsor our regenerative work. So High Mowing Organic Seeds is giving away cover crop seeds, a pound of cover crop seeds. And Sonali, Balaji, I'm going to put this in the chat. We will follow up. So the every all access pass holder is in the drawing. So if you're not here, when it's your turn to win, we're going to email you. So we are also, the Celestial Planting Calendar is another prize. It's a beautiful, planting guide, learning to harness the power of nature. Nature is so brilliant, and we have easy to read to help you. Looking what Cheryl Dixon. Cheryl Dixon is the winner of the Celestial Planting Calendar. High Mowing Organic Seeds is giving away cover crop seeds at every session. Celestial Planting Calendar is giving away calendar at every session. We have an hour of consultation with Robbie Gass from All About Organics that we're giving away tomorrow, Tuesday. We have a microbiometer starter kit that we're giving away on Wednesday. And we have Heart and Soil magazine subscriptions to give away as well. We'll do that in the next session. We would love to spend the rest of the day and the rest of the week with each of you. We do hope that you have set aside the time to come back for the following session. Bob Garthson will be sharing cover crop options. Bob Garthson is in the room with us now, but what we're going to do is turn off this link, invite you all to step away from your computers for 5 minutes, go get a drink of water, and come back at the top of the hour, and come back on the same link. That helps us administratively. We're going to close the room, walk away, come back in a few minutes. So thank you. And Ben, I hope we have the pleasure of being in the room with you again. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. And you can find, Ben is graciously shared his PowerPoint with us,
Okay.
so we'll have access to that. And
it's already in the course login. If you're an
perfect.
all access pass holder, it's already there.
Okay, awesome. So big love, appreciate you and love you. Ben, you make yourself an amazing, I guess it's evening now. What time is it for you?
It is. I've just got to make the kids dinner now. My wife's decided to go away for work tonight, so I shall be slaving over a hot stove in a minute.
Oh, nice. Awesome. Well, give everyone our gratitude at the Soil Association as well for your continued work and awesomeness and for sharing you with us today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Big love. Thanks to everybody in the room, and we will see you back here in just a few minutes.
Yes.
Hey, ciao. Bob, we get to talk to you next. I'm so excited. We're gonna log off of this, Bob. We're gonna close the room and then we're gonna come back on. Okay, so we can just start fresh.
Yep. Yeah, I thought you needed me ahead of time. That's why.
Yeah, you know what? We ended up going over, so that's why we're still here. So,
okay.
But for the recordings, we're gonna close it up and then we'll come back on. So you can hop right back in. Okay.
Yep.